one of the things that you say is hitters must load rhythmically to respond under pressure, avoid rigid mechanics, focus on readiness. That obviously is coming from your experience in pro ball, right? What made you put this in the book? Like, why do you find this to be so important?
For a simple reason. You walk around any Little League complex or watch any Little League game, and you'll hear multiple parents or coaches when the count gets to 3-1 or 2-0, whatever, make it be perfect, make it be perfect. And that takes you off the trigger right away. If a kid hears that, they're thinking, oh, it's got to be perfect. And that's just not how the game works. I cringe every time I hear the make it be perfect, make it be perfect. I think coaches everywhere and parents need to just be more willing to let their kids swing at a bad pitch, but maintain their aggressiveness and let them over time learn that pitch isn't one I hit very well, but I'm going to stay aggressive, and I'll over time learn to check off of my swing and go from yes, yes to no.
If we can see a hitter maturing with his swing take decisions, whether it be on video or in person, a light will go off for evaluators. Wow, you see that? He's making adjustments. That's great.
I want to introduce to the podcast today a familiar face, Gus. You've obviously been here before. We're going to call you a legend. Believe it or not, we've got really, really good feedback. Not surprising, by the way, because obviously, Gus, I've known you for a long time. And outside of you just being what I would call kind of like a scouting expert and executive in Major League front offices, you're also moonlighting as a comedian. We oftentimes spend the majority of our time talking about is you giving me your jokes. With us, in addition to Gus, is his brother, Hugh. And Hugh, so I want to go over a little bit about your background because I think it'd be helpful for our audience to understand the information that you and Gus are both going to provide today is going to be very impactful, but I want them to understand why. So you have carried various roles. You've been a coordinator at a time, a director of hitting for a major league organization, an assistant big league hitting coach, and you're currently back into a certain role with a new organization that we're not going to name yet because it has not been announced. But Hugh, I wanted to welcome you to the podcast. And if we could, I want to kind of jump in first. And I want to talk about from a personal standpoint, Hugh, you're somebody who actually has sons who are at a young age, kind of going through the Little League travel baseball world. Can you talk a little bit about your experience and what you've kind of gone through, at least recently, kind of in that role as somebody who has expertise having worked in the big leagues, but also somebody who is a father. So what has that been like, kind of navigating that?
Yeah, so I have 3 boys, 12, 9, and 6. So they're getting progressively more aggressive in the travel ball circuit, and they all are obsessed with baseball. My oldest is probably the most obsessed. So he's, we live in Georgia where it's a pretty competitive market and even at that young an age. So we're right in the thick of all that. We do a lot of Perfect Games headquartered here in Georgia. So we do a lot of their tournaments and are heavily involved with a lot of that programming. So, and before I got into pro ball, I was mostly coaching youth players. Before I got into pro ball, I started to do some more, private lessons and stuff with college and some pro guys. And was sort of the bridge that got me into pro ball. One of the guys I was working with had played with the Mariners, and I got my first coordinator job and first job in pro ball with the Mariners. So I've always sort of been bridging the gap between youth baseball and professional baseball, and paid a lot of attention to where things that we were doing in pro ball that were working and not working applied to youth baseball, and how now obviously how it might apply to my kids. So, I'm around Little League fields all the time when I'm home. And I see so many things that parents, are doing that I don't think is as helpful as they hope it would be. So I started paying a lot more attention to that too. And then I'm trying to put something together, a book that sort of hits on some of the biggest lessons I've seen that might help some of these parents where they navigate that world and get a few more clubs in their bag on how they can help their kids, whether it's how they do lessons, how they practice off the field, and sort of the kind of advice they give in game and on the field during games. So, just trying to bridge both worlds there and using some of the stuff I've picked up along the way in pro ball to help.
So I want to talk about the book because you were gracious enough to send me where you're at with it right now. And I think there's a lot of really interesting points that you raise in this book. So if we could, I want to kind of dive into the various lessons that you talk about in the book. And then I'm going to have questions really for each of you guys. Hugh, from your standpoint as a father, but also as, on the hitting side with pro organizations. And then Gus, with you, how a lot of this stuff kind of ties into the scouting component and how you're having to look at, or in your various roles have had to look at and really identify and evaluate the effects of all these different things. So
I sent this thing to Gus a month ago. There's zero chance he's read it yet. So if he's being the older brother, he's typically been, that thing's still sitting on a printer somewhere. But
we can rewind back to June, Matt, when I had my charity golf tournament. Neither of you guys appeared. Matt has a number of clients, not one auction item. Hugh, I should say, had plenty of athletes at his disposal, not one auction item. So thank you both.
Well, what I love about you, Gus, is I get a phone call from you. I think it was like a week after, and you said, "Hey, thanks for coming." And I said, "What are you talking about? Thanks for coming to my golf tournament." When was it? How come I didn't get an invitation? All you got to do is let me know. I get nothing.
Well, your audience knows you're a revisionist history major, so we can make things up. That's all right.
And this is the comedian I was telling everybody about. So thank you for letting everybody see that side of you. So Hugh, lesson 1 is control the controllables, right? So the core idea there is really focusing on what your son, or let's just say if you're a coach listening to this, focusing on what your player can control. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean when you say that? I think fundamentally it makes all the sense in the world, but I think sometimes people throw these terms around without really understanding how important it is. What exactly did you mean when you said that?
Yeah, so you see it obviously at every level, and my first experience with it was pro ball. Everything in pro ball wants to pull you towards your results, your batting average, your own individual stats. I mean, everything's trying to pull you away from things you actually do control. So you get pulled away from process and pulled towards results and end up focusing on the wrong things sometimes. And we know how emotionally charged youth baseball is. And you can just flip on Instagram and find thousands of clips of parents yelling at umpires or other coaches and whatever. It happens all over the place. So we know how emotionally charged it is. So just getting people to remind themselves that there's only so much you actually control in your development process. You don't control whether they catch the ball in center field or whether the umpire makes a bad call. And it's so easy to forget that. But it's just a simple way of saying process over results in a game that constantly wants to pull you towards emotion and results that don't connect really.
Well, and when you talk about it, you say things like, conditional confidence versus unconditional confidence. Help the families understand what do you mean by unconditional confidence?
Yeah, if I could get that across to more people easier, so many people are, especially in baseball, their confidence rides the wave of their last at bat, or if they got a hit, sure, they'll be better in the next game or the next at bat because they got that hit. That means their confidence is conditional on their previous at bat, or conditional on, you'll hear kids, they're constantly complaining that the pitcher, he's doing this, or he's throwing a weird curveball. Like, okay, is that the only way you can succeed, is if he throws it the way you're used to a pitcher throwing it? So getting people to understand that, if you prepare better, if you, if you just focus on process more, you find more ways to be, confident unconditionally, no matter what. You're not dependent on conditions being perfect that day when you show up at the park to play. For you to be successful. And again, all those things that pop up that are out of your control, whether center fielder made a diving catch on you, you got a bad call, the pitcher, it was tough to see that day, whatever it was, you're less affected, less vulnerable to all those, varied conditions that inevitably are going to pop up.
I think it's the reason why I love that it's in lesson 1, because I feel like if there's one kind of big ticket item that I think most players struggle with, it's that exact thing, right? I even recently spoke about a really, really good pitcher who, one of the best in the country. And I asked him, what makes you so good? And he paused and he's like, what do you mean? I said, well, what is the thing that you believe makes you what you are? And he literally sat there and didn't know how to answer it. And then he eventually gets to this place where he says, well, I can tell you this, what brings me confidence is when I'm performing well. And it's exactly what you're saying. Well, we know that in any career, right, whether it's in amateur baseball, college, or even in pro ball, you're going to get to a point where you hit failure, you struggle. It's part of this game. And if all you're doing is being reliant on needing to maintain performance at every single stage, like you're going to get to a place where that stops. And then what does it say about you when you fail, right? And I think, I've had Zach Scott on this podcast, Thad Levine on this podcast, and oftentimes what I hear from these executives, and Gus, we've even talked about this, is these organizations, they almost want to create failure early for players so that they can see how that player responds. And then hopefully they get the tools that they're going to ultimately need when they get to the big leagues. And that failure becomes much more a part of their game. Instead of, let's just say if you're a hitter, instead of going 0 for 30, maybe you go 0 for 10 and you can get to a place where you're having success a lot quicker. If you're a pitcher, instead of, having a repeated number of innings where you're just mechanically out of sync and you don't have that confidence, how do you minimize that negative side of your performance as quickly as possible? So Gus, from a scouting perspective, how do you, maybe it's communicate with other scouts? Because I know in your history in this game, like you've overseen a lot of various scouting positions, right? How do you tend to teach scouts to evaluate that? Like, is there things that you're looking for, or?
All different spaces, whether it's amateur scouting, pro scouting, international scouting, we have to get at how do they manage the game has never been noisier than it is today with all the information, all the social media, all the tech, the feedback that an athlete receives. So we do our best to educate our scouts on how to best get at. Now, you can't always get into homes, and the domestic amateur player, you can get into the home and you can try to get at are they process oriented, like Hugh talked about, or are they results oriented? What types of adversity have they faced in the past and how have they dealt with it? Are they a critical thinker? What do they do with the information that they now have at their disposal? What level of exposure have they had? Because that can dictate, most importantly for our evaluators, regardless of the stage, is how much you're going to project on that athlete. Maybe they've already been exposed to a lot, right? And so therefore you can't project quite as aggressively as you could on a kid who hasn't been in a weight room, hasn't been exposed to the tech, hasn't had great coaching. So there are a lot of things that we try to get at with the 360 evaluation, talking to their teammates, talking to their teachers, talking to their coaches in other sports, seeing them in an uncomfortable environment where they're not the guy. Maybe it's a different sport. Maybe it's in the classroom. We try to get at all of that to think about the noise that they deal with.
What's interesting is I feel like when you talk about all players, as I've gone through this book, Hugh, each one of these lessons, I think sometimes parents can get so hung up on looking at this like it's like a math equation, right? Like, okay, if I do A, B, and C, then I'm going to get the result I want. And then, okay, let's go to the next lesson. And if I do A, B, and C with this next lesson, then I'm going to get what I want. But in reality, all of these things are connected, right? If you're not controlling the controllables, you're oftentimes maybe not going to have that unconditional confidence that you're talking about. And then that ties into this second lesson, which is what you call is let them play. The core idea there is prioritize game-like reps over drills to build adaptability, variability in practice should mirror real chaos in a game. And so can you talk about that a little bit? Because I think it's a brilliant point. How many of these players, when they're focused on development, because I talk about this a lot with, oftentimes the hierarchy for parents is exposure is the most important thing. And then maybe number 2 is the competition, right? And then number 3 is development. And I've always encouraged players to really spend time developing. But what I'm kind of understanding, or at least what I'm receiving with this lesson is, well, what kind of development, right? There's a way to develop, but also making it game-like. So What can you talk about as far as that goes with like how, when you've spent your time with these various organizations, right? In let's just say a coordinator role. And I'll use like the Mariners as an example, because you obviously worked with a lot of really, really good players there. Did you guys have anything in place that you would kind of employ to help these players really create that like game-like chaos that you're talking about in practice?
100%. Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, this comes up all the time. I literally just sent a text to a parent who was talking about their programming for their son all winter and how they're going to get lessons and get their extra reps here and their extra reps here. And I just was kind of pumping the brakes for them a little bit on, just make sure that not all practice is created equal. And, some of it honestly can be detrimental. So you're not 100%, like you said, the ABC isn't necessarily making your player better if you're not doing things that are beneficial. So I think the simplest answer, working backwards from what the game is like, and having all your practices try to be as representative of the game environment as you can. It's not always possible. That's the challenge of baseball. It's not easy to get into a pickup baseball game like it is in basketball, for example. But the more you can, some of the best stuff you can do is get out there with a brother, or just if you have a dad or even a mom who can throw a half decent BP with, even if it's a wiffle ball, make it move a little bit, throw it hard, have a wind up. It's going to feel a lot more like a game. And now you're using actual game-like cues, game speed. You can use your game bat. Those practices are so much more valuable for, what's going to actually, transfer and be retained by the player when they actually get to the game. So obviously you got to pay attention to burnout and not doing more than the kid wants to be doing. But I think that was a huge part of Bryce Harper's development. He wasn't, sounded like he was spending a lot more time playing games and seeing real pitching, and guys trying to get him out with a mix of pitches instead of just banging off a tee in the backyard or with a lesson coach in a cage every day. So
the analogy that you used in the book too is perfect. And I want to kind of invite everybody into thinking about this. So you compare a zoo tiger, right, with the guy who, let's just say, needs to be in this perfect environment where he is working on one thing a certain way. And then the alternative tiger would be like a jungle tiger. And that would be the guy who is more like the Bryce Harper, who's like really trying to maximize his development by doing things a certain way. So yeah, I don't know if you want to touch on those two things, but I felt like that was a great analogy.
Bryce is the perfect. It sounds like he was putting himself in the jungle every day. He didn't know what those pitchers were going to throw at him. It was always an unpredictable environment that was in a game every time. That I think the zoo tiger in baseball is that kid, that's in a cage for 90% of his swings that he takes, with a instructor feeding a flip or a controlled tee environment or whatever. And that's the zoo tiger who, if you threw out into the wild, is far less prepared to get food. That the tiger that's been hunting and running around, climbing trees and running over mountains to get his food is going to get that steak a lot faster than the zoo tiger had it thrown in the cage for him. So
there's a level of fearlessness in there that a scout would identify. And I remember at the time he was young for his level, right? He always pushed himself playing against older kids.
You're talking about Harper?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I think that's part of his DNA that made him the great player that he became. I also think, just to circle back to what Hugh was talking about from an evaluation standpoint, we're not always just looking at games. Yes, the game environment's ideal. However, we do want to see how players practice and how do they go about their business at practice, especially when no one's watching.
Right.
So that is something that, whether it's game-like or not, that is something that scouts are definitely mindful of.
That's a great message too, because a lot of families and especially players, I think everyone is so stuck on this idea of games where they think that scouts are only there, right? I need to get up for the game. And in a sense, it almost feels like they're thinking about baseball like it's football. Like I play once a week, and if I have a good game, then I'm in a good spot. And they're not thinking about all these other opportunities that they have throughout the week. And if a player can hear this and get to a place where he is getting up for practice and he's thinking about practice as an opportunity, whether someone is there or not, it doesn't matter. The intent should be the same, because that's the thing that I'm hearing from you, Hugh. It's not like the reason you're getting up is because a scout's there. The reason you're getting up is because you're trying to match and take advantage of every single opportunity, big or small, to use it as a way to get better.
100%. Yeah. And I didn't even fully answer your original question, but in professional baseball, I think almost every team at this point has bought this pitching machine that's probably the most advanced pitching machine on the market. It's a really expensive machine. Traject, and you probably talked about it here, but it has, full spin replication, exact replication of a pitch you would see from any pitcher in Major League Baseball. And it has a video of that pitcher, synced up to the pitch, and you're tracking it as close to a game scenario. You can sit up there and face Garrett Cole, his full pitch mix for as long as you want on those machines. So, and players are doing that all over professional baseball now. Yeah, our kids going to have access to that machine, maybe in some select facilities coming soon. But the best thing you can do short of that is find somebody that's willing to throw, that is good enough to throw hard enough for your level and have a little bit of a mix to the pitches where they're not just throwing one speed, and get up there and face it as much as you can. It's the best thing you can do.
The way that you describe it is get that finger on the trigger. And the core idea is train early preparation and instinctive reactions. And one of the things that you say is hitters must load rhythmically to respond under pressure, avoid rigid mechanics, focus on readiness. That obviously is coming from your experience in pro ball, right? What made you put this in the book? Like, why do you find this to be so important?
For a simple reason. I walk around any Little League complex or watch any Little League game, and you'll hear multiple parents or coaches when the count gets to 3-1 or 2-0, whatever, make it be perfect, make it be perfect. And that takes you off the trigger right away. If a kid hears that, they're thinking, oh, it's got to be perfect. And they go off of basically go right from the bat. Now you're, waiting to see if it's a strike and then deciding to swing. And that's just not how the game works. I'm sure anybody listening to this watches their favorite team, Major League team play, and gets frustrated when, a Pete Alonso or, any of their favorite players chases the ball in the dirt. But there are a lot of major leaguers chasing balls all over the place. So why is that happening? Because they're aggressive. They're aggressive first. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. And I cringe every time I hear the make it be perfect, make it be perfect. It's like, no. You got to stay on the trigger. You're in attack mode. And in younger ages, I think coaches everywhere and parents need to just be more willing to let their kids swing at a bad pitch. But maintain their aggressiveness and let them over time learn that pitch isn't one I hit very well, but I'm going to stay aggressive, and I'll over time learn to check off of my swing and go from yes to no when it's a ball. But that, it's cliche. You hear yes, no all the time. And the better coaches out there with youth teams are saying that a lot, which is great. But just to caution people from getting too passive and keeping that go mentality is critical.
That overtime part, Matt, from a scout standpoint, we've talked about this before, is just over time, what are we looking for as evaluators? It's the ability to make adjustments. And no better thing in swing take decisions. If we can see a hitter maturing with his swing take decisions, whether it be on video or in person, that is a huge a light will go off for evaluators. Wow. Do you see that? He's making adjustments. That's great.
Even with pro guys, we in every organization, I've had players who are chasing a little bit too much. And every time we've told them to you got to take those pitches, chase less, or the messaging is too, reduced chase centric, they lose who they are. They lose their aggressiveness. And I've seen it go the opposite way where they end up getting worse. So finding ways, hey, we're going to stay really aggressive. Let's target this part of the zone more when you do it. But I think the messaging there is so critical.
Well, and I think, again, Gus, you brought up adjustments too. Within adjustments is failure, because you're adjusting from failing to success. And these players think it's like, I've got to go 4 for 4 every day. I've got to strike everybody out. So when they walk a guy, or if they strike out, it's now, this game is ruined. And no, what I'm hearing you say, Gus, is what you're paying attention to as a scout at that game, or if you're a recruiting coordinator, it's, I want to see what the guy then does the next at bat. Does he make that adjustment? I want to look at the guy who just walked the bases loaded. What is he going to come back and do the next batter? That other stuff is already done. This whole concept and idea of making an adjustment within it is failure. So we're not avoiding failure. It's how we're responding to it that is the most important thing.
Yeah, from pitch to pitch, game to game, day to day, season to season. We're building history as evaluators. I've become much more aware of, with all the noise that we all face, whether we're athletes or just human beings, is, are you able to center yourself and breathe?
Right.
I think, and my brother and I have talked about this a lot in the athletic space. Nothing tougher than hitting major league pitching, especially with these bullpens that are coming out in the fifth inning now. And you're going to fail, but are you able to center yourself and regroup and stay prioritizing process? If we're two words that have come out with Hugh's talk here, it's prioritizing process over the results.
Hugh, let me ask you this, because if a parent is listening to this and they're the parent that you described earlier, which is yelling at their kid, swing at the perfect pitch or wait for the perfect pitch, what is something better? And it's not that there's like a perfect word, but like, what is a more appropriate thing that they could remind their kid of? And I'm not saying that's ever in the middle of an at-bat, but maybe after a game that this mom or dad could do that would be more beneficial for the kid to really kind of wrestle with and think about.
Yeah, I think the simplest way to do it is just, what was your plan there? What were you trying to do? Just start with that question and then build off of that. If they're like, well, I mean, I was trying, I knew he was going to throw a fastball. I was trying to drive it right back at him. Okay. Then that's a pretty simple approach. And if it turned out that they took a fastball right down the middle, you got to, drill down from there on, okay, what happened? And then you just keep asking questions and eventually they're going to say, well, he threw that curveball to Jimmy the at bat before, so I just got curveball in the back of my head, and that's why I took that fastball. Perfect. You just solved a huge problem. You've answered. You've done it without screaming at the kid. And that happens all the time to players where they just get the wrong pitch in the back of their head and they basically end up guessing and guess wrong. So it's an easy lesson there. Okay, well, you had the right plan. You just got distracted for a sec. So just make sure Gus is saying, use your breathing techniques or whatever to stay focused in that moment so you don't lose your plan and you stay on it. And then when you get that fastball, you're all over it.
I think that's great. I just did a podcast actually about the difference for parents between expectations and agreements. And this is kind of in the same vein where, oftentimes parents have these expectations that are not communicated with their kid. And instead, what they need to do is they need to make agreements with their son. And what that entails is having a conversation and asking questions. Instead of telling them, do this, ask them, what were you trying to do in that at bat? That is going to create, in a sense, them lifting the mental weight and learning from the experience. When you tell your son, what are you doing? Why did you do that? What do you think he's going to say? Well, obviously, if I swung, I thought it was a pitch I could hit. Yeah, I made a mistake. And instead, they feel ridiculed and they're not working through it mentally in the way that they're ultimately going to have to be doing at the next level, whether that's in college or pro ball.
Yeah, and just to put a button on that lesson in general, I think if everybody just flipped their mindset to it's way better to be too aggressive at young ages than too passive, way better. So they'll learn over time. They'll swing at enough fastballs over their head that they don't touch, that mental representation of that pitch gets built and built and built, that eventually they'll stop the swing at that point. But you can't lose the aggressiveness. And it's so hard, especially if you're a dad or a mom and a coach. When you're coaching, you get into coach mode, and coach mode can often be you're directing kids here and there, even whether it's just to keep them in the dugout and stop sitting on each other's laps in the darn dugout. You're in a very directorial mode, so it's hard to get to a question-based coaching mode. But the more you can think, I don't do it well all the time at all, and you're short on time and you want to give the direction and get out of there. So just reminding yourself how, that there's so much that you get paid off by asking questions instead of just shouting directives.
Well, I know one of the biggest challenges parents have is they may even be thinking and, hearing this saying like, I can't even ask my son any questions because anything I say to him, he's like blocking it out. And that's where it's like, all right, well, when's the right time to do it? It's probably not immediately after a bad game, right? Maybe it's a little bit later. Maybe it's the coach that needs to hear this because the mom and dad can't be the one that says anything because he just doesn't want to listen to mom and dad. So it's the coach needing to be mindful of asking questions and not doing the same thing that mom and dad would do, which is just directing the ridicule towards them. All right, so the next lesson Teach them to coach themselves. This one I love. So foster self-awareness so players diagnose and adjust independently. The ultimate goal is autonomy, not dependence on a coach or a parent. I think this is one of the most important ones, because when you talk about a player who's ultimately successful long-term, if you're living and dying by any individual coach that you have at any one level, well, guess what happens? At some point, if you're in amateur baseball, you're going to get older and maybe that coach isn't coaching you anymore. Maybe you get to the minor leagues and you get traded. And now that coach who coached you that you loved isn't there anymore. So you being able to coach yourself, at the end of the day, this is your career. And so for these young kids listening to this, Hugh, how would you recommend that they go about learning to be their best coach?
And that's where the questions are so important, where you're raising, every time you're asking a question, instead of shouting a directive, you're raising that player's self-awareness over what's going on. I'll cap it with a really simple example that I kind of switched in the last couple of years with my son's 12-year-old group. When I help out with them, I would always, when they'd get to third, I'd be there at third base and be, hey, ground ball, you're going, fly ball, you're tagging. And I would just shout these directives, and they're just in follow mode, follow coach's direction, and they're never thinking about that. And we constantly screw up, whether we a tag up or a whatever. And I just completely flipped the script. It was like, when they get there, I'm going to say, what are you doing on a ground ball? What are you doing on a fly ball? How many outs are there? And it got them to start thinking so much more about how they were going to do it themselves. And that was, our results changed dramatically on how often we got the right read in those scenarios. And it was, I would attribute it 100% to just flipping the coach script there, to asking quick questions instead of shouting out orders of what they're supposed to do.
On that note, Gus, so for you, again, on the scouting side, you guys are paying attention to everything. First off, what is it that you see when you watch a player to say that, oh, this guy actually, he can coach himself on some level? Like, he understands this game. He understands his game. What are maybe some of the things that you see that would tell you that a player actually does?
Well, we first try to get at what they've been exposed to. We talk to their coaches on what they've been working on with them, if anything. How, if it's an advanced program or an advanced organization, how do they take to all the information that you're providing them with game planning or with drill work? And we try to get at their critical thinking. So yes, we want the best athletes, but we also want those instincts and those that can take information and apply it quickly to help them make those adjustments. And those who can raise their hand and say, I'm not getting this. Like some humility too, just to have this cue is not working for me. And so just some self-awareness that Hugh touched on earlier, we can get at through conversation with the player himself, getting at his environment and those that are around him, whether it be the coaches or the parents.
It's amazing what humility does too, because I think a lot of times players think perfection is the goal. I need to give off this idea that I am this perfect player, right? And in reality, and an example that I'll use, and it's not related to baseball, but in football, Jalen Milroe, the old quarterback at Alabama, I read this article where when he was going through the combine, all of these teams were so impressed that in his answers to questions, he was articulating his weaknesses. And then he would go so far above and beyond to say, and this is what I'm doing to work on my weaknesses. And so you would take what seems to be a negative and he turns it into a positive. Look, humility is one of the greatest things that you can have. If you can get curious with yourself and really ask yourself, like, how can I get better as a baseball player, and not be afraid of it or hide it, but actually get it out into the open. What I think you're ultimately going to realize as a player is you're going to have people that are going to come alongside you and give you the tools to help you make those adjustments and make those changes.
I also think it's just a level of accountability when you are vulnerable. Your teammates, whether they admit it or not, are just as vulnerable.
Of course.
And I think they'll appreciate that. And no tougher environment than a clubhouse, right? When you're with each other all season long for 162 games. It's hard. And if you're accountable and you have potential to be a leader, or at least at a minimum, a good teammate, your teammates will pick up on that. Your coaches will pick up on that.
Well, yeah. And if you can get it out into the open and identify it, it's going to turn into a strength long before any one of your teammates is going to be willing to do that. So if you can look at humility as actually a tool that you can employ, I think at the end of the day, that's going to be one of the things that leads you to getting better sooner. And I don't know many kids at these young ages now in amateur baseball nobody wants to feel that way, right? We're kind of trained to avoid it. So
I've spent a ton of time for coaches and for players diving in on that like confident humility spectrum and what the ideal position on that spectrum is. And I think, and we see this in pro ball, sometimes we're so focused on the development piece for a minor leaguer and their weaknesses, and they got to get better at this, and they're not going to get from A ball to high A to double A. That players also, you can go too far down that road, and players can also end up feeling like they're always broken. Like, this is still not working. So balancing it out with knowing, hey, you still also have these superpowers and these huge strengths, and constantly reinforcing the strengths while you are working on the humility. Obviously, you got to know the individual. If it's a guy that's got zero humility, then sure, that's where you can tip the scales more towards that end of the spectrum. But just making sure you also maintain guys' confidence in a game that's trying to pound away at them with failure all day is critical too.
Spot on. Yeah, so the next lesson is begin with the end in mind. Now, this one for me, maybe a lot of the coaches listening to this could get something from this, but reverse engineer practices from game demands. Clarify purpose to align efforts. Obviously, I know plenty of coaches who, they'll have practices, and I know there are a lot of really good coaches out there, and some will have a specific plan with intent on what they're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, it's an industry in the private lesson world and in the professional development world in baseball, where again, if you're, people are constantly trying to work on their swing, work on parts of the game, and we have all these training tools and all these facilities that are meant to help with that. What gets lost there is working backwards from game results to be like, is this something I should actually be working on? You can end up in a cage, be hitting with a guy who's a pretty good hitter, maybe you're doing a lesson with him and you and another guy with a coach, and that guy has a leg kick, and you're like, hey, that leg kick looks pretty good. That guy is hitting the heck out of the ball. You start doing a leg kick. Well, does that connect back to something that's happening to you in the game that you need to fix? Is your timing off and you need the leg kick because you're late on fastballs? Sure, if that's the reason you do it and you worked backwards from something that's going on the field, and then building all your practice designs off of, if you're swinging and missing under a bunch of high fastballs, most of your practice can be around working on the high fastball. It's the game has showed you that is a weakness that's being exposed more than you probably want it to be. So work backwards from that to fix it, instead of just randomly going to a lesson, he didn't like your first swing off the tee, so you end up working on something that's totally disconnected from what's happening in the game.
A good thing for every player to kind of ask themselves before going to a practice, or a coach to even ask themselves, is like, why are we doing the thing that we're doing today? Like, what are we trying to achieve? Right? Because I think you're absolutely right. If the goal is like, okay, I need to take 100 swings today. All right, well, why? What are we trying to do in the cage with those 100 swings? And I'll even use an example. Joey Votto, who was a client of ours, he would, and everybody would know this about him, the minute he would step foot in a stadium, like he was in go mode, like just completely different intention, completely focused on what his task was that day. And every single swing he took in a batting cage was 100% effort. Now, there are probably some people out there that'd be like, all right, well, let's slow down a little bit. But I think it's more about his intention was so clear that everybody knew when he was in the cage, he was working.
And you're not just kind of taking swings to take swings. The anecdote I hit on in the book that I think is perfect for this is this. I don't know if you remember the Hawaii baseball team, probably a handful of years ago now, that just torched the Little League World Series. I mean, they hit homer after homer, all the swing. It was like, I was so intrigued by it. They were hitting homers to center, right center. Like they were driving balls middle of the field. The ninth hitter was hitting homers. So I knew somebody who knew their coaches and reached out and, was eventually able to get in touch with them. And it was such a cool conversation, just because it's this begin with the end in mind, totally the perfect example of it. They had been there the year before. They didn't win it. They saw what was there. They saw really fast pitching. They saw those pitchers were always trying to target the outside part of the plate, because sometimes umpires would give them that call and they didn't even have to throw it over the plate half the time. They saw that the best pitchers had a good fastball and a mix. They knew exactly what they had to do well to get back there and win it. And that's all they focused on the next entire off season going into that. They went and they got 13-year-olds from the team before. So they'd throw harder than anything they'd ever seen. They got everybody up on top of the plate, basically both heels on the chalk line on close to the plate. So they knew everybody was throwing fastballs away. They went and got elbow pads so they wouldn't get hurt if the ball snuck inside on them. And they just drilled it and drilled it and drilled it, faced those 13-year-old pitchers every day, throwing mix and hard, trying to target the outside. And that was their practice regimen, and it completely paid off. If you just go YouTube that team, it's hilarious watching how many home runs they hit and how they torched everybody.
Oh yeah, I remember plenty of people who are listening to this, players even, who think to themselves like, well, I don't have a process right now. I don't have that plan. And I know from a scouting perspective, when you identify players, like you obviously want to make sure that guy does. But if you're that 15-year-old kid right now or 14-year-old kid and you don't have that yet, well, guess what this is? It's an opportunity to make an adjustment. For scouts, Gus, I think sometimes all these players think, oh, I'm not going to get scouted until my senior year. But I know that not to be true because you guys are obviously at all of these other events, maybe watching seniors, but guess what you're going to see? You're going to see some other kid who's a sophomore or a junior and you've never seen him before and you're like, oh, that kid can play. And so you write the kid's name down. So even though you're not bearing down on that kid, there's still plenty of opportunities for these kids to be seen. And so then what happens when that 14 or 15-year-old kid who you may have seen a couple years ago, now he's a senior and you're looking at somebody totally different and you're like, oh man, I can tell this guy's made some adjustments. He's actually made a lot of improvements.
And that's where building history is so important for us in scouting. And it's not just, I would argue, not just in person. Now with today's technology, with the video, all these showcases, and we just have so much more video at our disposal, which affects the Marriott points for sure. We're not traveling quite as much.
Right.
But we just have so many more looks to complement all the data that we're also collecting on these athletes. So it's a very informed opinion. Still hard because you're betting on human beings. I can't say that we're necessarily that much more accurate, but we have a lot more reps and a lot more info at our disposal.
So I think this next lesson may be the most controversial. Controversial meaning like people are going to be like, oh, they're going to be paying attention to it, which is value the test of time. Trust enduring principles over trends. Filter social media noise for proven methods and be mindful of TikTok fads in these travel ball circles. And I know plenty of people where they are going down rabbit holes on whether it's YouTube, TikTok, all the social media, and there's these new hitting coaches preaching this one way of hitting. So, Hugh, what would you tell these parents who do that, or watch their son do that? And every tournament, it's like they're trying something new and they're tinkering constantly.
It's I don't blame any of them. It's hard. I get drawn in by the next TikTok infomercial as much as anybody else. I mean, they do a good job selling. A lot of guys do a great job selling stuff. And there's a lot of really quality content that might start off as a trend or a fad and ends up standing the test of time and being something that every organization is doing eventually. So this isn't a binary choice here of, just do the older school stuff that's worked and completely reject the new school. It's just both work. This chapter in particular is about, hey, we do know for sure, if you want to trust what's most reliable, the stuff that's been around in the game from, the early 1900s and is still there today is probably worth paying a lot of attention to because it's worked for a really long time. So it's just a reminder that that's the more reliable stuff. And, I've been just talking to so many players at the major league level. Every one of them talks about having a foundation built as a kid that was, on the fundamentals, on the, getting the routines right, and millions of ground balls and millions of swings. And, the foundational part of the game is always going to be incredibly important. And just, it's easy to forget that when you get caught on the most recent Instagram video that lures you in. So,
yeah. We represented Josh Donaldson, and I feel like, at one point he was like the poster child for, swing like Josh Donaldson, right? There's this guy who's not the biggest, not necessarily the strongest, even though JD was a freak athlete and extremely, extremely strong. But it was like everybody needed to duplicate the leg kick, him and Jose Batista. And sure enough, what we all saw happen was, you may have perfected the leg kick in a batting cage. The minute you go into, a game and all of a sudden you can't get your timing down, you're not replicating it enough. And so then you try something new and then you go on to the next thing. And so, yeah, these kind of fads and these trends have popped up for the last 20 years. Even more reason why I feel like a lot of these players do need to be mindful of like, not every swing, not every different trend is meant for every single different body type.
Well, you have to ask questions and dig a little bit deeper. Why is this happening? Day to day or at bat to at bat? Does he trust himself? Is he getting overcoached? What's going on in his environment that is leading to this? And if you can get at that, it helps just to get a better feel for what exactly this player is dealing with in his environment or within his own head.
Well, I think this leads perfectly to the next lesson, which is always individualize, right? Which, Hugh, I know you talked about in the book, but like tailor your unique needs, your body, your learning style, and avoid this one-size-fits-all approach. I think a challenge sometimes is a kid may go to a particular hitting coach who tends to preach really this one way of hitting.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a lot of coaches out there that are doing better with that. And I think, there's some groups out there that are really pushing the individuality of movement, profiles and how humans are so different. You're seeing it more at the pro level, but that is starting to trickle down to youth levels. But, like it goes right back to the Instagram thing. You see, a drill or a trick or a device that a pro coach posts on Instagram, and you think, oh, that's going to work. Yeah, it might be the right tool for the right guy, but not necessarily for everybody. So just keeping in mind that everybody is different and not everything is going to connect with every player, and just doesn't mean you can't try some things, but don't be afraid to pull the plug if it doesn't seem like it's resonating.
When you get a guy in pro ball who swings a certain way, and maybe you're watching a swing and you're just like, man, this isn't going to translate in the big leagues, right? For whatever reason. How challenging is that to deal with? Because maybe this kid's been swinging like this and it's just what he's always done. And to his credit, he could point to his stats and say, yeah, but it works, right? Maybe he's in AA and he's like, it's never failed me. So what do you mean it's not going to work in the big leagues? Like, what would you... When you see, if that's ever happened, I know that it's happened because I've obviously had guys who have gone through it. But when you've seen stuff like that, I guess talk a little bit about what you see and how you handle that situation.
I think it goes back to why working backwards from the game is so important. If a guy has not been exposed yet, there probably there probably isn't a reason to fix it until that flaw gets exposed. Now, obviously, if you have seen a lot of Major League Baseball and can bring that experience to a minor league player, for example, or if you've seen a lot of college baseball and can bring an example to a high school player where, hey, that you're very confident that that's not going to work for them when they get to a higher level, then your sales pitch better be really compelling, because if the player's not bought in on making the change, it's not going to work anyway. So getting the player to buy in because they believe, okay, that makes sense. I've been exposed enough on that pitch, whether it's a high fastball or whatever, that I buy into this can help me solve that problem. But nothing is showing up on the field that's showing that they can't do it this way. I'd be really, really hesitant to make big changes. It's really hard to predict how a human can organize themselves in a different environment to find ways to succeed. So some guys, as many guys have, been able to predict that they're going to struggle. There've been a lot of players out there that people thought they were going to struggle when they got to the major leagues and they didn't. So just approaching that one carefully is huge.
When we're training evaluators, we're very careful. The big disclaimers: there are no absolutes. They come in different shapes and sizes with things that may not look right. We're not trying to cookie cut our players. And it's okay if they're smaller or I remember they laughed back in the day at the Pedroia selection, or Hunter Pence had a lot of moving parts, right? In that swing, it looked like he was in black and white footage. They don't all look the same, but like digging deeper, looking at the performance history, reverse engineering from the games. What is the game revealing in their performance that would suggest that this won't play at higher levels?
All right, so I'm going to skip ahead because we only have a few minutes left. I want to go to the technique chapter. Okay, because the technique chapter, the core ideas here, focus on fundamentals, alignment, adjustability, sequencing for depth, direction, and swings. I guess my question for you, Hugh, is, players and coaches oftentimes can get really overwhelmed by the mechanics, kind of like we've been talking about. How do you take something that is extremely complex, like a hitter's mechanics, and how do you teach it in a way where they're focused on the things that matter?
That chapter was by far the most challenging.
Right.
I went back and forth on whether it was even worth including because it's so hard. Like we just spent 10 minutes talking about how important it is to individualize things and how there's a lot of different major league players skinning the cat of offense in different ways. So it was a really tricky chapter to write. I tried to boil it down to the simplest things that seem to apply, that I've seen apply across as many major league hitters as I could. And most anybody that's a baseball fan's probably seen that meme or that picture of all those hitters at launch position. Those players, almost everybody is in a pretty similar position. So I tried to work backwards from that. There's not too many guys that when they get ready to actually launch the bat are in a drastically different position than all the other top hitters in the game. So just working back from the simple things that go into basically getting to that position, and where you at, start your swing from and building off of that. So that was the alignment piece, was just making sure your body and your bat are, in as good a position as they can be when you go to move into the hitting zone with that bat, that they work well together and make the hitting task, seem as easy as it can be and more efficient. At youth levels, you'll see right off the bat, if you just focus on that, a kid goes to fire, instead of being in a good position with his hand, the bat is still way tipped out when he's going to fire. And it's very clear, like he's just not giving himself a chance to even get that bat on plane with a pitch when it's, deeper in the zone. So really simple, was meant to be a really simple way to just look at a few basic things right before they fire the bat that usually signal alignment that's easy to use in a game.
And Gus, from a scouting perspective, when we talk about, process, right? What can you say? Because you've obviously seen guys come from the amateur level and then move on through the professional ranks. And some of the best hitters, let's just say as an amateur, maybe don't develop into being the player that organization thought they would be. How much of the time is that related to, well, they didn't have a process?
It could be. And we're just trying to, a lot of times our scouts are best at identifying some talent changes or mechanical changes that might lead to something better than what we're currently seeing. And so that the data might not reveal. And so those are the types of things we're looking to complement what we're already gathering with the measurables. So if we see something with the mechanic change, like an introduction of a leg kick, or maybe it's a body change because he applied himself differently in the off season, or got exposed to different training, that type of stuff. We're constantly trying to look for what we call talent changes. And therefore, maybe the player is more available. When the guy's dominating and everyone knows about him, they're harder to acquire, obviously.
Yeah, of course. All right. So as we wrap up, and I would be remiss not to come back to your charity, Gus. So I want to touch on that. But before I do, I want to leave everybody with something that you have, Hugh, at the very end of your book. And I just want to read it for everybody so they hear. What you say is, if there's one idea I hope you take from this book, it's that great coaching, especially when it involves your own kids, isn't about finding shortcuts or magic formulas. It's about building something steady, layer by layer over time. It's about mastering the fundamentals, teaching them how to think instead of what to think, and creating environments where learning, growth, and confidence happens naturally. And then you actually have a bonus section, and I'll put this on our YouTube and our Instagram. If you want his guide, there's essentially like these 7 takeaways. DM me guide on Instagram, and I will send you this list. But I want to read this very last section here that you have that talks, I think, kind of phrases coach perfectly. and you have the original meaning of the word coach comes from the old horse-drawn carriage. The old horse-drawn carriages that carried people from one place to another. That's your job too, to guide, not control. You're carrying players along their development journey, not dragging them there. And I feel like that is absolutely perfect. And then your final thought is, if your child or player loves the game more at 18 than they did at 8, you've won. That's the real scoreboard. And I feel like that is a perfect way to end kind of like not only this conversation, but more importantly, as we go into the future, we've all seen parents who, to no fault of their own, they want what's best for their kids. At the end of the day, that is what they're trying to achieve. They want to help their son maximize his opportunity, live out his dream. I just think sometimes we all could kind of get lost in the shuffle a little bit and go down these rabbit holes and think that we've got to control this stuff. At the end of the day, we want to make sure that your son is growing as a man. He's enjoying the game that he's playing. And so if he's having more fun at 18 than he is at 8, then that is certainly a win. And how can we help? Because I certainly don't need to have you back on the podcast again and then getting called out for not doing my part.
No, I've been overexposed with this podcast, so I appreciate all the invites.
It's not just in baseball. It's also, in charitable work.
But I'm also shameless, so I am spreading
give
orange.
The shameless plug.
Right here. Spreading orange for the group that I work with. My family and I joined over a year ago, MS for MS. So MS, the number 4, MS, helping those that are fighting the disease multiple sclerosis that I also have. I was diagnosed back in 21 and been working through that challenge with a lot of other MS warriors. And we're just trying to not only invest in research to someday come up with a cure, but also find those that are in need, that don't have the resources to deal with the adversity that comes with the disease, and try to help them out when we can. So Holly, my wife, and my girls are all very proud to have joined that group. And hopefully you and Hugh can join us next year for that event. And
what's the website, Gus?
msforms.org.
Okay. I'll put it on the show notes too, so if anybody wants to check it out.
Always appreciate that, and just wanted to wish you guys a happy holiday. And Matt, thanks for having me. And I'm glad you were able to bring Hugh into this conversation. It's important. He's coached at every level, and so I just thought, and you agreed that you'd have a really interesting perspective. So I learned a lot today.
I know I'm going to get a bunch of messages about the book. Do you have any idea when it's going to be out? Do we know yet, or it's still?
Send it out to some agencies, and one agency in particular is interested in helping develop it. So they're trying to finalize that development process of it. But so hopefully in the next few months we'll get something wrapped up and out that people can get to. But that's we're getting there. We're close.
Having gone through the material that we just went through, and obviously me. And again, for everybody who wants to see the parent guide, you bring up some really, really important subjects that I think undoubtedly will make parents and coaches tremendously better, and in turn, the players. So this is something that I think is important for kind of the next generation to receive. So kudos to you for writing it. I know that's not easy. And thank you both for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Yeah, I mean, it's nothing revolutionary. It's stuff I screw up still to this day, and it's more just to help remind you to get back away from the emotions of the game and back to the things that may actually move the needle for guys. I don't know if you saw the Rick Pitino clip of him crushing his team in the locker room after the last game.
I haven't.
It's great. It's gone a little bit viral. He just, they had a tough half or a game, and he's just crushing them. Who raised you guys? Like, what is going on with you guys? Like, show me some toughness. But my point to that is, I feel like more and more coaches at the higher levels in college and everywhere are going to be looking for players who can separate themselves with some of these skills. And that's sort of, hopefully the book will help parents cultivate that, and help players stand out because they're doing some of these things the right way. And it'll really stand out to, high school coaches, college coaches, and pro scouts like Gus. So,
well, and let me know when you got it to the finishing stage, because I'd love to either have you back on or even do whatever I can to help promote the book. Cause it's a no-brainer.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Quattlebaum brothers. Appreciate your time, boys.
That's a mouthful.
Yep.
See you guys.